All right. Well, good morning again, everyone. My name is Mike Millian. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the president of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today for one of our monthly webinar series. Today, this one is called "Are You Doing the Same Old Road Test?" which we will get to in a second. Just before we get started, I want to go over a few of the layout logistics for today's meeting. The meeting is being recorded. So when the meeting is concluded, everybody will get a link to the recording of the presentation, and you will also get a PDF of Chris's PowerPoint that he's going to go through today. When it comes to asking questions, we have about a 50-minute presentation we're going through, and we're going to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers from the audience. It is set up so that only myself or Chris can turn on our video or unmute ourselves. So we ask that you put your questions in the chat feature. You can direct them towards myself. So just click on my name when you ask your questions, and then I will read them out to Chris. Or if you don't mind everybody seeing your question, feel free to put it in the normal chat as well. I'll leave that up to you. I also want to thank our sponsors today for making this free webinar possible. And today for sponsors, we have the Ontario Truck Training Academy and the Alpine Truck Driver Training School, both TTSAO members, which most of you will likely know. PMTC is an avid supporter and part of the TTSAO board, and have been for years, and our associations do a lot of work together to try and advance I guess the correct protocols, procedures, and policies to make sure the best truck driver training in Ontario is out there. So I want to thank them for their sponsorship. Now, we don't have a video from them today, but I do just have a quick message from them that I want to read through. So first of all, thanks to Alpine Truck Driver Training. They are a family-owned and operated business with over 40 years of experience in the transportation industry. They're committed to provide quality training instruction to students who pursue a career in the trucking industry. Alpine is dedicated to provide safe and professional training and to supply reputable transportation companies in North America with qualified drivers. Again, thank you to Alpine for sponsoring today's webinar. And our second sponsor is the Ontario Truck Training Academy. They are dedicated to driver assessment and development. They offer commercial license training, over-the-road assessments, cognitive assessments, and new hire assessments. Feel free to give them a call. You see their info there on the slide, and this will also be sent out to you in a PDF at the end of today's presentation, so you will have the information on there for our sponsors, and feel free to reach out to them if you have any questions on what they offer for new license training or for corporate training. And with that, again, thanks to our sponsors. And now we're going to get into today's topics. So today we have Chris Wilkinson with us. Chris is the sales manager from Empirica Inc. Chris educates and supports new and existing clients with their fitness for duty program requirements. Chris has almost a decade of experience, including program development, third-party provider management, training and policy development. And Chris has had the privilege to work with over 1,000 great companies in a variety of industries across Canada and in the USA. In addition to being a certified human resources professional, Chris also holds a business diploma from Humber College. Outside Chris's role with Empirica, he spends his downtime with his family, which includes his wife, 3 beautiful children, and their dog. And Chris, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this topic to the group here. I'll bring up my presentation, but I want to give you kind of a little background on where the idea of this topic started from. So working with Tom Baylor, it was Tom Baylor from who actually came up with this question. And he was at the TCA conference last year in the US, I think it was Nashville. And at one of the roundtables that he was hosting, he posed the question, are you still doing the same old road test? And when he told me that topic and the conversation it sparked, I jumped on it. I said, you know what, Tom, you and I could work on this together. I can put information. I'll do some research. Obviously, there's things that our company does. There's things I've taken from what Herb's doing. And I was able to come up with the slide deck, and he and I have been traveling around Ontario this year doing this presentation. So it's a big thank you to Tom Baylor for this as well. I wanted to call him out on that too. He's unable to attend today, but thank you, Tom. So I also want to really thank our sponsors, Jack from Alpine and Yvette from Ontario Truck Training Academy. I know I've spoken with both of you and supporters of our program, and thank you, Yvette. I see even in your promotional information that there's some information about what we're working on together too. So really grateful for your support for this presentation. All right, Mike already did my introduction. I see a lot of the names of people I've seen that are attending today. I've worked with as well, and I've known for years. I believe at this point, I'm actually at a decade. I'm at 10 years of Fitness for Duty program management. So I think I have to update my my bio. I don't have any more kids or dogs, so I can leave that part the same. But I have reached a decade of working with trucking companies, just really in particular, managing drug and alcohol programs, driver medical assessment programs, and fitness for duty assessments. So why are we here today, and why are you spending your time with me? Probably because you're working from home and you wanted to fill some time between meetings, or because you're really interested in this topic, which I hope is the other part. I hope that you're really interested in this topic. And the topic is, are you doing the same old road test? And what I was able to discover working with our clients, but also, again, talking and working with Tom Baylor on this, is that no two road courses are created equal. And we'll go into the meat of this throughout the presentation. No two driver evaluators are equal. And what is your road test not telling you? And even at the end too, I'll give you a little bit of concept of some ideas of what you could start with in looking at when you're reviewing your current practices. But the main thing that we're going to focus on today are the road courses, the driver evaluators, and then what's your road test not telling you in regard to maybe medical fitness. So let's start with best practices. So there is literature out there that will support you in your review of your program. But let's start with when our road tests performed. And these are the key areas. There might be a couple other ones that you can think of, but most companies, when they're doing road tests, it's because it's a pre-employment assessment. And they're performing the evaluation. That's where the variables come. They're not like the length of the evaluation, the driver evaluator, and how they're doing it. It's different from every single person to every single company, but the majority of road tests are being performed on pre-employment. And talking to insurance companies, I've heard the term bulletproofing your front door or securing the front door, certain things like that, making sure you're doing everything you can before you bring somebody on. And that's where that road test comes in too. Working with organizations as well, performance reviews. So I've got clients who will take their drivers out on the road periodically or on performance review days. Sometimes it's 3 years, sometimes it's 2 years, or 5 years, might be based on license renewals. So those two are a little bit interchangeable in the term, but there are companies that are finding additional touch points for those road evaluations.
Hey, Chris,
return to work assessments. Yep.
Chris, sorry to interrupt. Just one person's typed in the chat that sometimes your voice is going up and down. So I don't know if you can maybe just move a little closer to the mic if you can.
No problem. Okay. Hopefully this will be a little bit better. I'm moving a bit closer to the screen so you'll see my face even closer. Okay.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay. The return to work. So talking about my history and 10 years of working in fitness for duty, return to work assessments are very difficult. They're very challenging. And if you have an individual who's off work for medical leave, and now they're returning to work, organizations are usually left to say, now what? And a road test is a good opportunity for you to do an evaluation on somebody on a return to work. It's part of the bona fide occupational requirement of the job to drive a vehicle and drive safe. So building in a standardized program to evaluate that individual's ability to return to work. We've had situations where, working in my previous job, where somebody would be going to an occupational therapist who specialized in driving safely. And they would have that person go out on the road with the individual in that actual vehicle they'd be driving to evaluate them. And we're looking at thousands of dollars for those types of assessments. So in some cases, it's not cheap. But these are very important decisions when you're returning someone to work and making sure you're returning them to work safely. So doing what you can, based again on the bona fide occupational requirements of the job, return to work is a great opportunity to perform a road test or evaluation. If someone's switching vehicle types, there's also training and mentoring programs where somebody would be going through. I'm hearing more about straight out of school drivers going straight into mentoring training programs and then having these periodic road tests with them to make sure that they're improving in their abilities. So that's coming up. And then obviously schools are doing road tests as well. So there's lots of opportunity and lots of cases where road tests can be performed. So why should you perform a road test? So I'm going to read what Tom Baylor wrote for me here, because this is a slide that I asked him to put together for me. But what he commented on here is this is the single most important onboarding function in which a driver can demonstrate that they can safely perform the duties required of the position. It demonstrates the motor carrier's commitment to safety with a diligent road evaluation. While a road test does not guarantee the driver will never be involved in a future crash, it is a good barometer for determining if the driver is high risk. And then he also mentions the concept of having good documentation in case there is a future claim, to say that the organization has done their due diligence in minimizing, so that hopefully to minimize that claim against them, to say they've done everything they could leading up to the crash or incident to protect them. What we find too with statistics is that companies who have a really good onboarding process, including a really robust and standardized road test, there is a reduction in attrition. So the number of drivers who they onboard and lose soon after, it's usually within 90 days. And then overall, we are tracking too, but the performance of those drivers, of newly hired drivers, it improves and it goes up. So it's, you're able to onboard with better success and the performance of those drivers are better. So it's really worth the investment into making sure that you actually have a standardized and a little bit more robust onboarding and road test. With the supporting literature, this is one of the areas I want to direct you to. So the CCMTA, so it's the Canadian Council of Motor Transportation Administrators, National Safety Code Standard 2. And under this section, there's knowledge and performance tests, and it's chapter 8, reading what's on the screen for you, but this is where I want to direct you. And there's a section here about pre-drive vehicle check. So this is a vehicle inspection, and then evaluating the driver's ability to do a vehicle inspection. That's under National Safety Code 13. So if you're looking at revamping and kind of reviewing your current practices for the road tests, this is a good area that you can start. There is a section on the road assessment, on-road assessment, and it's interesting how the CCMTA identifies it. They start off by saying for commercial vehicles here, high-class vehicles, in addition to standard elements for passenger vehicles, and then they have a list of the requirements, which includes backing up, shifting, attention sharing, and then there's even a section in here, oops, I went too far. There's a section in here on parallel parking with a combination vehicle. I don't think any company is doing parallel parking. You're probably training people not to get into situations where they have to parallel park a combination vehicle more than you train them on that. But so the CCMTA does have their information for you. And then there's a whole section on air brake testing as well. When we get to the next section on the CCMTA, this is about designing road courses. And what I like to point out here is a couple key things. One is maximizing observations. And when we're working with companies on reviewing their current road testing practices and their road course design, we find that there really isn't this maximizing observations built into their road test. And the idea behind that term is having the most opportunity within that period of drive that the individual will be challenged. So making sure that there's not, if you live in Kitchener or Waterloo region, make sure that there's not just one roundabout opportunity, that they have multiple. If you, in busy intersections, making sure there's more than one just busy intersection that they have to go through, more than one just left-hand turn. So building in the complexity into that road test so that it's not just one opportunity to see how they perform, because they might just happen to be a very easy turn that day. And now you're going to be judging somebody on a easy day compared to what it might have been for someone else, which was a very challenging day. So building in multiple opportunities for or maximizing those observations. Another term that I like to point out from this list is the uniformity of maneuvers. And the CCMTA actually has a definition of what uniformity means as part of the road test design, road course design. And I'll read it here for you. It's all applicants must receive essentially the same test, no matter when or where they take it. Applicants with the same ability should have the same probability of passing the test. The uniformity of maneuvers means making sure that it's consistent for every single person and not just for one terminal, is that you have a consistency over multiple terminals if you have that, or even just with multiple driver evaluators. We even find that with one driver evaluator for one terminal, that person may decide to go a different route each and every day on how they decide they feel to go. We had one driver evaluator tell us, I go where the wind takes me each day. There's no design course, there's no design length, there's no maximizing observations or uniformity of maneuvers. It was the driver evaluator's decision each day of where to go and how to manage that. Another one I want to point out here is objectivity. And this is going to come up on the driver evaluator portion, but there's really not a lot of objectivity built into road evaluations. What we find, what I've been working with companies and seeing, is that it's subjectivity that is designing courses. Maybe it's day by day, or deciding how we're going to go with each location designs its own course. But it's also a driver evaluator determining risk based on the subjective opinion of the performance of that person. So maximizing observations, uniformity of the actual course across multiple locations or even just one location, and the objectivity. How do you build all that in? And do you have that built into your development now? And what I find is most companies don't. As I went deeper into this research to find what other literature is out there to support, and I thought the FMCSA, I'm very familiar with the FMCSA regulations in dealing with drug and alcohol testing, and 381 and Part 40, and then also 391 for hiring. And so I went into 391 and found road tests. And under 391, I'm not going to list all the sections here, but I thought I'd point out a couple of things that stood out to me. One is the duration. So it must be of sufficient duration to enable the person to give the evaluation, evaluate the skills. It's very ambiguous. So one organization, one location might go the easiest 10 minutes around the block, where another same company at a different terminal might do 2.5 hours. And that was one of the things that Herb was finding. Tom Baylor, again, I'm going to mention him a few times through this, but one location was just going around the block or going wherever the wind blew them, and another location was going 2.5 hours. So there was no consistency in the duration of those evaluations, which was making it very hard for the team at Herb to review those cases to support them. Another part is the forms. So how to evaluate them and on a paper form. Most companies are still using a piece of paper and a pen. And that's fine. I mean, as long as you're tracking the information in real time, but working with companies and doing these presentations now, I'll get individuals say back, well, I don't like to mark while I'm on the road because I feel it's a distraction to them. And I say, okay, maybe that's an older practice of understanding of, we don't want to distract them while they're driving, but what are you missing if you're not filling out that form or tracking the errors that are occurring while you're driving? And I'll get arguments on the other side saying they still prefer to fill out the form afterwards, but I push back and say, well, what are you missing? What have you forgotten when you're out in a road test for an hour, getting back to the yard after you do a post trip with them on the vehicle, and you have a conversation with the driver before they leave, and now you get back to your office and you start filling out the performance form? What have you forgotten in that time? And there could be a lot. So it's still, paper copy is the common practice. And there's even a lot of companies who don't even fill out that form while they're on the road. And what we've seen too is reviewing driver evaluators' performance. It's seeing that a piece of paper that's being filled out is being filled out consistently the same way for all different drivers. So the same errors are being marked, the same boxes are being checked. There's this consistency bias that's going into it. Maybe it's because the driver evaluators are in a comfort zone of filling that out, or they know that's how the driver could get hired, or they know they won't get hired if they fill it out in a certain way. But the paper copy we're finding really is a gap. So, and how and when it's being filled out. The FMCSA lists their road test requirements of what they recommend. It's a little bit more specific than what the CCMCA has. And again, number one is pre-trip inspection. A lot of companies do not perform pre-trip inspections with applicants. They'll say, oh, we'll train them on that later. We'll just go out on the road and see how they do first. Recommendations would be get as much information up front as possible. Don't skip important aspects, but companies are still skipping the pre-trip inspection as part of their review, including coupling and uncoupling. And as I'm not going to read through this whole, but if you want to check out the reference, again, it's 391.31 under road tests. Who can perform the tests? So this comes from the FMCSA as well under best practices, but really it's anyone who has a commercial driver's license who can take over the reins of a vehicle, who the company has determined to be able to do them. which could be anybody, could be a supervisor, veteran driver, certified evaluators. There are courses that offer to certify evaluators. I've heard of a few that I'm interested in learning more about as well. Working with companies, I'm finding out, and talking to a lot of trucking companies, I'm finding there's a lot more companies who use outside vendors, which I think is great. Like, you know, if you don't have the resources, and especially hiring remote all across Canada or even in the US, how are you going to do an evaluation on someone if you can't get them to your area? So you use outside vendors. But have you vetted those outside vendors? Have you reviewed the courses that they complete? Have you reviewed the evaluators process? If you're using multiple vendors, is there a consistency with those multiple vendors? I would say probably not. Not what I've seen is that there's a lot of, again, inconsistency with the quality of the driver evaluators, especially if they're in-house and maybe it's a terminal manager. We've had a conversation recently with a company who's using terminal managers, and the idea is that the terminal managers are hiring and determining based on need over risk. So there's concerns all over the place on who's going to be doing the evaluation. I'm not saying there's not great people too, but I'm just saying there are significant gaps. Okay, so now we're talking about no two road courses are created equal. The main idea here, again, I brought up all the points from the references and the supporting literature that you can look at too, but the skill testing it varies by company, terminal, driver evaluator. They're not having a consistency in place to say this is the standard, this is the course, this is how we monitor, this is how we ensure our driver evaluators are scoring the skills appropriately, building all that into the actual course. The variation of complexity and the consistency of complexity is very different, even within a single organization. Even with a single terminal with one driver evaluator, the course may change every single time they go out on the road. And the duration is significantly different by company to company, driver evaluator. So there's nothing out there to tell you how long it should be. I've asked people and said, hey, what's your thoughts on it? And I've had individuals say, oh, it has to be an hour and a half. And others say, oh, it has to be at least 50 minutes. And oh, it has to be 2 hours. And you say, well, where are you getting this information from? And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find anything to say it needs to be just a length. So a company is the one deciding, but by you deciding, have you made that decision for your organization as a whole and then use that across all areas and across all individuals, or is it still subjective to whomever is doing the test? No two driver evaluators are equal. And this is where we get into a little bit more of the subjectivity side and the risk. So say you've gone through your road courses and you go, you know, we feel great that we've maximized our observations and we have uniformity of maneuvers and there's objectivity built into our course and we feel great about our course development and we're happy there. That's great. Okay. Now you got to look at your driver evaluators. What are the driver evaluators doing to determine that individual is safe? And most cases, what I've found is that driver evaluators are using subjectivity to determine risk. It's their opinion that day on what that person's performance was like. The driver evaluator's interpretation it varies by person to person. We did a round table and we had driver evaluators put up their hand when we said, is this a high risk maneuver? Is this considered a high risk maneuver? And nobody put their hands up at the exact same time. So everybody has a different interpretation of what a good driver is, but also what a perceived high risk driving level is. And again, I'm going to call on Tom here and his program, but when we reviewed their program, what he identified is that he had driver evaluators who were failing applicants because of what they perceived as high risk. So they let drivers out the door, applicants go out the door, because the driver evaluators had a misunderstanding of what this high risk meant. And they looked back at it and said, we feel like we could have trained these individuals and all the other information we had was good on them, but we lost these drivers because there is not a consistency in what driver evaluators, how they interpret the performance of somebody. Qualifications vary significantly. As I talked about with that terminal manager situation, there's pressure from operations. And even now, even recruiters are being pressured by operations to get drivers in the seat. But are they making decisions based on a risk assessment, or are they just basing it on operational needs? And companies aren't doing KPIs and performance tracking. Maybe some, I can't call out everybody, but a lot of companies I've worked with they don't have a system in place to track the performance of their driver evaluators. And what I push back, I say, well, just take all the piece of paper that they filled out, if they're still using paper, which most likely they are, and lay them out on your table and start to look for these these consistencies. Like, are they marking the exact same errors for every single person? Are they filling out the same terminologies? Oh, there's good driver, so and so. And one of the things that we notice is that driver evaluators fall into this comfort zone where they'll just fill out the exact same information over and over. And we track it in our system. We call it they're marking too similar. And they're marking the exact same errors over and over and over for every single person. So tracking it, their performance, as well as some kind of KPI structure for them as well. All right, what is your road test not telling you? One of the things that comes up here is, was it just a good day for the driver? As I talked about that maximizing observations, you maximize the observations, you're going to get a better chance to see if it's trying to push them outside of that, could it just be a good day? Having the backup at the beginning, I like this practice that I've heard from a number of companies, but you have them back up right at the very beginning, and then you have them back up at the end again, have them back up. Making sure there's multiple left turns, traffic lights, so just building in a lot of opportunity. And it can be still done in a short period of time. You can do an evaluation 45 minutes, hour and a half, depending on what you need to build into it. But just making sure that you have enough opportunity in there to make sure that it's not just a good day for that driver, that you're actually getting performance out of them. Is there any underlying impairment? So the underlying impairment is where we're going to get to in the next slide, but you can't identify that on a road test. And I've seen as well individuals who've had a stroke. This has come up recently where there's an individual who had a stroke and they were having a lot of memory issues. But they're driving, when they went out on the road to evaluate their performance after there's a few incidents, the driver was great on the road. They had a great road test with the company. But when they did the other side of the evaluation, which was a cognitive assessment, they failed. And it was because they lost all their short-term memory, unfortunately, because of the stroke. They still had their long-term memory and their ability to drive a vehicle, but the short-term memory was gone. And those are things that you can't uncover just with a road test. The company said, if we would have just gone by the road test that day, we would have had the person still driving on the road, but realizing that they did have a significant medical episode, which does impair their ability to operate a vehicle safely. Are we marking performance based on operational needs? How are you, as risk professionals, as directors of safety, as individuals in an organization who are making these very important decisions, how are you ensuring that decisions aren't being just based on operational needs? And if you're not involved, then you won't know. So it's just something I wanted to point out there too. And breaking down the errors. So there's competency defining errors and there's also trainable bad habit errors. Is your company separating those to identify, can we train this person? Is this an area that we're equipped to train? Are we working with a company like OTTA or Alpine or others who support us on training, that we know that, hey, this person has the ability to be trained, and based on these errors that we've identified on the road and issues maybe that we see in the yard, we can train this person. Say it's pre-trip inspections, maybe it's coupling, or maybe it's backing, or whatever it is. Are you able to break that down between competency defining errors or trainable bad habit errors? Or are you letting drivers out the door because you're perceiving it as competency, but it could actually be trainable? Or the other way around, maybe you think it's trainable, but it's a competency defining error, which the way that competency defining errors is defined is more hazardous in nature. Okay, so going back to the CCMTA, National Safety Code, Standard 6 now, and this is the determining driver fitness in Canada. This is not just for commercial drivers, this document, this is also for personal vehicles, but there's a whole lot of information in this document about commercial driver fitness, which I think is a really good read if you're, again, interested in educating yourself. Great area to understand, better understand the necessary requirements, the requirements for drivers. In this document, and this is something I didn't even realize, I can't say didn't realize, I really didn't put a lot of focus on when I was back doing the fitness for duty until about 3.5 years ago, when I started getting into what I'm doing now. And it's the cognitive functions needed for driving. We always just outsourced that and said, okay, occupational therapist, can you support this? Oh, the doctor, can you do some testing on them? But now realizing that there's ways to evaluate this and to do an assessment on a driver's cognitive functions, it was like light bulbs going off in my head. But there's 12 cognitive functions that have been identified as necessary. So when we look at the bona fide occupational requirements of the job, it's to drive a vehicle safe. And these are the cognitive functions that are necessary. So you need healthy cognition to be able to drive a vehicle safe. As we get older, we do have this natural decline of cognitive functions. That needs to be built into, if you do have a process here, it needs to be built in. So we're not discriminating, you're not discriminating against someone based on age because they have this natural decline. But what you're doing is you're identifying if somebody's cognitive functions are impaired. Not if they've declined, if they are impaired. And in individuals who have deficits in certain areas, say it's divided attention and selective attention, maybe it's and sustained attention, maybe it's their attention that they're lacking, they may be able to increase their cognitive functions naturally in their tracking, visual, spatial, and executive functioning to compensate for their attention deficits. So somebody could have deficits in some areas, but they may compensate for that in others. So it's not older drivers are going to fail this type of an evaluation. That's not the way it's built and designed. The idea here is that if somebody's cognitive functions are truly impaired, that means they're at an extremely high risk on road because it may be a medical condition, a medical episode, drug and alcohol addiction, drug and alcohol impairment, a lot of different reasons why somebody's cognitive functions could be impaired. Sleep apnea comes up, extreme hypertension, undiagnosed or improperly treated diabetes. There's lots of reasons why somebody could have impaired cognitive functions, but there's also a lot of situations where they can get back to work after some medical care and treatment. So just to put the information that I gave you into kind of a visualization or concept here, I've got two quick case studies I want to share with companies here. These are made up, but part true stories, part made up stories here, but there's company A and company B I'm going to present. Company A is 6 terminals, 2 provinces, and 10 driver evaluators. With this organization, they said some terminals did not have a designated road course, go where the wind takes me. Recommendations were based on the evaluator's opinion that day. So an evaluator would go out on the road test and they would be the last person to make a decision to say, yep, let's hire this person, let's not. So it was the evaluator making that hiring decision once everything else had been done. The organization found that they had a high number of performance issues with newly hired drivers, which then was leading to a high attrition rate of newly hired drivers. So with this organization, they did not have a standard approach to managing the evaluations, and it was affecting them in their performance as well as their attrition. Company B, and this is again just to give you an idea of how completely different every company is. So it's not one process fits all. They're all customized and they're all built around a company's needs. So company B, 3 terminals, 2 provinces. International recruiting as well, but they only had 2 driver evaluators to do all the assessments. Terminal 1, very high failure rate. They actually were almost failing most people who came through the door. The course was extremely complex. They were doing paper report that was completed after the road test when the evaluator went back to their office to fill out the information. And the evaluator makes hiring recommendations for the organization. Terminal 2 had a low failure rate, and it was extremely low. They were passing everybody. Road course didn't include a highway component, so it was a very basic round-the-block course. Same concept with the paper copy filled out afterwards when they got back to the office, and the evaluator was the one making hiring decisions. So even between those 2 terminals, there's significant difference in the quality of the course and how they were being done. Terminal 3, they didn't have a road test or a driver evaluator. So every time someone applied, they were asked if they would drive 2 hours to Terminal 2, and most of them said no. So they were having a really difficult time hiring from Terminal 3. With international recruiting, and this is where a lot of money can be burned as well, it's a great opportunity to bring people into Canada for employment. But with this situation, they had a driver evaluator from Terminal 2 who doesn't fail anybody, was going to the host company, making recommendations on who to hire. They would fly everybody to Canada, send them to Terminal 1, and then that evaluator would do a road test and say everybody failed. And then the company was left to say, what do we do now? Like, we've got you saying they're great, you're saying they're not, and now we got all these people here. What are we going to do? So it left them in a very difficult position. So those stories, I hope help paint a picture of the difficulty that every company is different, and every company is going to struggle with its own situation, but there are ways to standardize and manage how you do road tests and driver evaluations. Now, I'm going to put on my HR hat for a couple slides here. And I want to point out, and everyone knows this term, but unintentional discrimination. Unintentional discrimination is still discrimination. And we all understand that. It's been around for a while. The case I'm pointing out in this presentation is an Ontario-based law firm. So it's not a trucking company, but it's a law firm. And it's recent, back in 2019. So I thought it was a recent case. But it's the highlighted points that I thought were really good to support the content, but also to paint a picture of what unintentional discrimination really could look like. Age or race do not need to be the sole or major factor. It is sufficient if they are a factor. And with trucking, most drivers that are coming through are either younger or older. I'm not saying all, but a lot. And there is a lot of ethnicities and races that are playing a factor as well in the trucking community. There's no need to establish an intention or motivation to discriminate. That's why it's called unintentional discrimination. It's built into policies, practices, processes. It's not that you're meaning to, it's just that it's built into what you currently have or don't have when it comes to structure. No need for direct evidence, circumstantial evidence and inference is enough. That makes it so that it makes it very challenging for you to defend. And then the last point, age and racial stereotyping will usually be the result of subtle, unconscious beliefs, biases, and prejudice. So I'm going to take you over to the next slide, which is focusing on unconscious biases. And unfortunately, we all suffer from unconscious biases. It's all built into us. If you're aware of them, then you can do, I think, a good job of avoiding it. But we are all affected by this. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, the gender bias, ageism, name bias, beauty and weight, I mean, those ones are very basic to understand. There is halo and horn effect, which are the opposite of each other. The halo effect occurs when we develop an overall positive impression of someone because of one of their qualities or traits. And that does occur, especially when we're evaluating somebody. Performance reviews, that does come up, but also with applicants coming through. The kind of a basic explanation I use just to relate this is, if someone comes through and they're a Maple Leafs fan, and the driver evaluator is a Maple Leafs fan, and they start talking about the Leafs and how good they're doing, that has already put them in maybe a positive light, where the driver evaluator is going to have a affected opinion of that individual because of that. The horn effect is the opposite, where you focus on one thing that's negative, and that affects how you're judging somebody and evaluating them. So maybe they come in and they're wearing a Montreal Canadiens hat and you're a Leafs fan, and you guys get at it in an argument over that, and then that's the reason why. Now, it's a bit of a joke, I'm sorry, but it's just to give you an example of what it looks like. The one here that stands out to me the most, though, is the last one, is the idiosyncratic rater bias. And I'm going to read the definition for idiosyncratic rater bias, because to me, this is exactly what we're working with and dealing with when we're managing these programs and working with driver evaluators. So idiosyncratic rater bias affects the way we evaluate the performance of others. We often rate others based on our own subjective interpretation of the assessment criteria and our own definition of what success looks like. To me, everything that I'm talking about in this presentation, especially when it comes to the driver evaluator involvement, the idiosyncratic rater bias is what stands out the most to me. And we work with a lot of driver evaluators, and myself personally enjoy these interactions. There's a lot of ego that goes into these situations where somebody's very proud of what they've designed or the way that they evaluate, or they say, I've been driving for 20 years and now I'm doing this and I know what it looks like. I get into a meeting and I have somebody tell me, oh, I can tell if somebody's good in 10 minutes. They walk through the door, I immediately know if they're good or not. I have that. I've done this so long, I can just tell. You go, okay, this is, again, how you're determining risk. And to me, that's more ego than it is science-based. So it is sensitive. When we're working with driver evaluators and working with the individuals who are making these decisions, directors of safety are ones going out on road tests and trying to tell them, hey, did you know that you might be affected by idiosyncratic rater bias, and your road course design might not be meeting the consistent requirements to avoid potential unintentional discrimination claims against your organization? And they don't realize it. And it's tough, again, to get over those barriers to explain to someone that there might be something missing in your process. and you've been doing it for 20 years, maybe 20 years of being a driver evaluator, not realizing that you are doing the same old road test. And your same old road test is not really fitting in today's society. Now, the last point, which I took out of the presentation just because I wanted to have more of a discussion and answer some questions too, but it was, what can you do? So before I get to questions, let me just talk about what you can do as an organization. Start with the road test. If you have one location or you have multiple locations, have a look at the complexity of each one, the duration, have a look at how many left-hand turns, maximizing those observations, and evaluate internally. Do our courses have a uniformity built into them so that there's a consistency that an individual in a hypothetical situation, you have two drivers who come to you at two different locations, they would have the same opportunity to get hired if they have the same skill level. That's where I would start. Once you feel good about your course design, then start looking at, well, how are we managing the driver evaluators to ensure that there is consistency in their delivery of this? And preamble instructions are great to be able to help them explain what's going to happen, that they're going to score real time as errors occur. I do recommend scoring as you see errors on the road. The script on how to give directions, make sure there's a standardization on script so that there isn't a location bias that's built in or an advantage that an individual, because they know Kitchener, they have a better chance of getting a job than somebody who's maybe coming in from out of town. So making sure directions are designed in a way that there's no location advantage. Working on ways to evaluate the driver evaluator's performance. Having a look at how they fill out their forms. Is there consistency errors? Are they marking too few errors, too many errors compared to others within the organization? And then finding a way to be able to look back and monitor the program as well. Training, I think, is really key too, is having some form of standard training for driver evaluators, just so that everybody has some form of base platform to work off of. Here's the foundation of our driver evaluator program, so that if you're ever challenged to say, well, who's this person to make this determination, at least you can say, well, we did this training, we built these road courses this way, we've had our evaluators go through this process, and now what we're at a situation where we feel confident with the information that they're providing us, and we hired based on this, not just based on someone's subjectivity. And going back to shoring up that front door of your organization. All right, that's it. I came in short on our time, Mike. I left lots of time for questions today.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Chris. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, either generally or to myself. I do have a couple that have come in. So one, and you mentioned it briefly during your presentation, that it could be a 45-minute test, it could be a 2.5-hour test. Is there a time that you think is too short and a time that is too long?
Yeah, so if we're designing courses, we start with 45 minutes. Okay. 45 minutes would be the shortest that we would design. And then we'll work with an organization to identify additional components that they may need or want. Based on where they're driving, mountain components or city components, and making sure two opportunities for backing. So they do range in between 45 minutes to an hour and a half, but that's usually the range and what we're looking at. But what we try to do is standardize that time by location or by vehicle type.
Yeah, and that 45 minutes to an hour and a half, is that just the on-road portion, or are you counting like the pre-trip and the coupling and the backing? Is that in addition to that 45 minutes? Is the 45 minutes just on road?
The 45 minutes is just on road. Yeah. Okay. The trip inspection or the vehicle inspection portion, companies have heard go from half an hour to an hour with the individual. Working with some companies, they'll have drivers explain everything they're doing during a vehicle inspection so that they understand that the person understands what they're doing, instead of them just walking around and doing a vehicle inspection and they sit back and go, hey, they look like they're doing okay. Actually going through and saying, tell me what you're doing as you're doing it. So that does take a bit longer, and that could be about an hour. With Herb, again, I'll just keep using them as the example here, but Tom said that from the decision to move forward to the end of the road test is 4 hours. They
Okay,
blocked a
that's-
4-hour period, but they are now hiring after that 4-hour window based on the information they've captured. So they feel confident after 4 hours that they can hire an individual.
Gotcha. And I know you and I chatted before too, and as somebody who used to do road tests for a company, years ago, it floored me when you said some companies do not include pre-trips and coupling and uncoupling on the road test. I mean, to me, you have to do that. How else do you find out if somebody who's been driving for 20 years has maybe picked up some bad habits? I'm not saying it's a reason you don't hire somebody, but it's a reason that you can, their driving's great, but they miss some stuff on pre-trips. I would think you'd still want to find that out because that's a training opportunity and a learning opportunity. So,
Yeah, exactly.
Couple other questions. How do you standardize tests when you perform them in different seasons? So I'm guessing what the person maybe means by that question is, maybe during half load season, there's some roads you can't go on. Maybe during the winter, there's some roads you can't go on. So I'll throw that question to you.
It could also be based on the complexity. It's harder to drive in the winter and the conditions than it would be in the summer if it's beautiful out. What we're designed are a standardized course that they would drive, but part of the scientific algorithm and system that we use, it builds in how complex was the course based on weather. So if there are weather conditions that you're dealing with, could be heavy rain, it could be snow, could be whatever you're dealing with that day, you build that into the process in scoring. So it's not the road course itself, it's the scoring of the individual's performance. And we build it into the science of our program for that. If there are, say, road closures because of seasons, you always see it's either winter or it's construction season. So unfortunately, you do have to change your course if there are road closures, but you want to make sure that it still meets that checklist, like a checklist of how many left turns, and making sure that you have the same complexity across each location. But if the question is based around it's harder to drive in winter than it is in summer, you want to build that into your scoring somehow if you're able to.
Another question. I have found that a commentary drive during a road test often provides insight to a driver applicant's attitude and risk awareness. What are your thoughts on adding this to a road test?
Well, for us, our recommendation is not to have that commentary during the road test. It's a 45-minute to an hour opportunity to evaluate the individual's performance. I get that you want to have a comfortable situation where the person feels good and they're having a good test and you want to relate and continue the interview with them, but I think there's other opportunity to do that. By designing that preamble script to explain how the road test is going to go, companies have said that it really does take that pressure off of them and the driver to say, this is the road test portion. This is what we're going to do. I'm going to provide you instructions in this manner. I'm going to be scoring as we're driving. And then at the end, we'll get back to the yard and we'll do a post-trip inspection of the vehicle. It's a 45-minute to an hour opportunity to gauge the driver's ability, not to continue the interview. So I know our company, we're opposed to that conversation continuing in the vehicle. The person should be focused on driving, and the driver evaluator needs to be focused on evaluating the driver.
I think what he's referring to here, Chris, just to be clear, I don't think he's talking about, chatting about your favorite hockey team or what they did. I think what he's talking about is the driver telling you what they're seeing on the road. I see a car up ahead on the left. I think that's what he means by a commentary drive.
Okay, my apologies.
Where they're telling you the risks that they're seeing ahead.
Yeah, same idea with the pre-trip inspection, like having them narrate what they're doing. It helps you better understand what they're thinking. So I'm not opposed to the idea. That's not how we build our road test. To require the road evaluations to require the driver to narrate their drive. But maybe there are things that you want them to be able to identify and hope that they would see, and things that you can't just assume they did or didn't see based on the drive itself. So that's not a bad idea.
Okay. And yeah, he confirmed that is what he was referring to. So
I was ranting on something else.
I know there was an insurance company that used to do train the trainer and coach drivers and driver evaluators, and they actually had drivers do that. They had them do commentary drives when they were out there. So I have seen it done before.
Yep.
It probably depends on the individual. Some people it's probably good for, some people may find it distracting. I would think so.
And consistent, like one driver evaluator makes you do it and another driver evaluator doesn't. So the company really standardization. I think that's what I'm trying to stress today is find a way to have consistency and standardization to your process so that everybody is under the same standard. And if that's what the organization says, we value hearing commentary back from the driver on the road, and this is the type of stuff that you want to kind of look for, build it in. They'll make sure it's built in, but make sure it's consistent. It's not just one driver evaluator doing it, because a driver might say that was extremely distracting the whole time having to explain what I was doing. And, him asking me, oh, what are you seeing now? It's just, that might be something that is distracting to one person where they don't get a job, where other people don't make them do it. And two buddies go to get the same job and one guy doesn't get it because he had a driver evaluator that was asking him to talk the whole time. And maybe that's not how he is.
Another person asked, is there a standardized form or checklist that we can use
for road tests? So we have a standardized form that we use. It's a good question. I don't know where you would find one that's a consistent standard. Maybe even the Keller might have one. Keller, I can't remember what the last name of that Keller something is, but anyways, like that'd probably be a good spot to start with and see what they have. But you really want to have one that's your own and just make sure it's being consistently used. But maybe, what is it called? Keller Williams or something?
Yeah, and then they put in here road test and for pre-trip. Well, I would say the road test and pre-trip form are two separate things.
JJ Keller,
yeah, JJ Keller has it, but your road test form and your pre-trip form, I mean, a trip inspection has to be done on the vehicle before you go out on the road anyway. And every commercial motor vehicle company likely has the pre-trip. I mean, if you're in Ontario, it's Schedule 1, but there's standard forms that are available through the National Safety Code as well. And then sometimes you do have to change them based on you operating specialized equipment, right? So you have to keep that in mind too. Yep. So your trip inspection, I wouldn't suggest incorporating into your road test form. I would have a separate trip inspection form that you can use for the road test, but I would not incorporate that into your road test form myself. That's just me. And like I said, some people have specialized equipment that you're going to want to make sure that they're checking off and looking into that isn't on the standard van trailer. So, yeah, and others are typing in here that they have comprehensive forms as well. I think a lot of driving schools here as well are typing in that they have standardized forms that they do for road tests. So I would reach out to, if you have a school that you use, an insurance company that you use, you said JJ Keller, people will have those standardized road test forms that you can probably use. One more question. I know some people, I've heard it done before. I would never recommend it, but I'm busy today. Just grab this person. Hey, Fred, you've been driving for us for 30 years. Go ahead and road test this guy. And that definitely takes away from your standardization, right? But would you also, who's ever doing your road tests, do you recommend refresher training for them? And if so, how often?
Yeah, ongoing training. So I think there's a couple ways to look at training. One would be initial onboarding training. You want to review the performance of those driver evaluators to make sure that they're doing a good job, that they're not just marking these consistencies. So I think ongoing training, even if it's just a review of what they're doing and how they're scoring and getting them to explain their rationale and why they keep marking the same errors and where they're occurring, so that you have an understanding that they get it. The other side is the periodic or performance review, or even like you say every 2 years, we want to put them through another course just to see if there's any changes in what's going on. I wouldn't say there's like a right answer. I just think an organization needs to set, I think the performance review is necessary. I think onboarding is necessary. And then a company could say if we're going to evaluate our drivers every 3 years, let's evaluate our driver evaluators every 3 years. Like set a standard and just stick with it. Stick with the standardization of your program.
Yeah, no, agreed. Do you evaluate for attitude, road rage, impatience, aggressive driving?
So what's built into the road test itself is based on maneuvers. and how they're performing on the test there. There is a section for comments from the evaluator, including subjectivity, their subjective opinion, but we're trying to eliminate a lot of that subjectivity on the road test and make it an objective score based on their ability to drive the vehicle. What we want to hear back, though, from the evaluators is the road rage, impatience, attitude. There actually is a section on cooperative and if they're yes or no on being cooperative. And then the subjectivity of the driver evaluator section as well. What we find is impatience is measured on our cognitive functions test to start with. So we do have a couple of assessments where they are required to hold down a button and wait for the light to change before they move their finger. And if they can't, it's an impulse thing, right? So it's or control. So we do measure that impatience in the assessment. We also measure for high risk, so high risk behavior. I wouldn't put that under road rage, but I would put that we do measure under high risk. But then the evaluator is part of this as well. So it's not just there's science, but we also do require the evaluator to be able to observe and identify certain behaviors. But we're not specifically measuring road rage.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I also think there's parts within that road test that are actually their road rage and impatience and aggressive driving are going to show up in areas that you can mark, right? Like stopping too late, aggressive braking, right? You know, that'll be a mark on a road test in a lot of cases. Cutting people off. If they're doing stuff like that on a road test, that's stuff that you can mark without saying the actual terms that we're using, but I think it's showing those behaviors, right? And I mean, we all pretty much understand, I think, that somebody's generally on their best behavior when they're doing a road test. So if they're showing road rage, impatience, cutting people off, harsh braking, going too fast on a road test, that's a pretty good indication of what they're going to do once they get out on their own when you're not around, if they're doing that on a road test. But,
right.
But and then just somebody says have a stop sign that you have the driver make a left-hand turn on. Yeah, that could get into, you know, not waiting for somebody to come ahead or actually not even possibly knowing the right rules of the road. But anyways, I don't think there's anything else here. Chris, anything else you want to add before we bid adieu to everybody?
Yeah, I want to mention the like new drivers to the industry. So one of the things that we're going to be working on at Empirica is evaluations of newly trained drivers. There's kind of like this maybe stigma against newly trained drivers out of school, MELT certified, but then they go through training programs like through OTTA and Alpine, who have this, you know, focus on really good drivers. Like they're not just putting, I'm not going to say this about the harsh way, but they're not putting crap out there. They're putting good drivers out there. And these individuals, we're evaluating them through our system. And yeah, maybe there's some areas that they need improvement on their road performance because they're new drivers. But when we do cognitive assessments on them, they're fine. Like they're doing well on the cognitive assessments, but they need maybe mentoring and coaching and comfort level of being in a vehicle, something that's new to them. So I hope there's going to be this kind of push toward working with schools and getting these new drivers into these trucks faster. I know insurance does have some restrictions maybe in there, and there's other areas where there's restrictions and requirements. Companies say, oh, they have to have 3 years of experience with us. But what we are seeing is the newly trained drivers coming out of schools. They really are doing well on the cognitive side, which means that there's not that risk of impairment that could lead to an incident. A lot of it's trainable, and a lot of it is maybe mentoring and comfort. They just need comfort of being in a vehicle and familiarity of it. So I just wanted to point that out at the end of the presentation, because I know that's something that I'm going to be working on in the new year. So
no, and I would agree. We were all new drivers at some point in time in our career. And at some point he put it up, how long should we train somebody, a new MELT driver? I don't think you can have a standard thing. A lot of companies have good mentoring programs, and I think most of your mentoring programs might have a minimum amount, but you don't really know how long you should train. It kind of depends on the individual and how well they're doing, and that's why you have good quality mentors to work with them. But yeah, it's when a driver comes out of a school, they are not a finished product, and anybody that expects them to, there's something wrong. What I use all the time is a doctor doesn't go through medical school and then perform open heart surgery the next day on their own. right? You have to do on-the-job training. MELT is entry-level training, and then it's up to carriers to have a good mentoring program to finish that person off. So as long as they have the basic skills, then you have to give them the experience and the training to go along with it. But with that, I do want to make sure we get everybody out of here on time. So thanks a lot, Chris. Thanks to our sponsors, Ontario Truck Driving and Alpine. Thanks to everybody who took the time to join us today. A recording of this and the PDF will be sent out in the next day or two. And I want to take this time from my family to yours, and on behalf of the PMTC and its members, wish everybody Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, season's greetings, whatever you celebrate over the holidays. Have a good holiday season and spend some good time with your family and friends. Take care.